Thomas Hartwell had been living on the streets of London for 18 months, but he still remembered what it felt like to wear a clean uniform and stand at attention. Every morning, he would wake up in the doorway of a closed shop 3 blocks from Buckingham Palace, carefully fold the thin blanket that served as his only protection from the cold, and begin his daily routine. Unlike many of the other homeless people in the area, Thomas maintained a strict schedule. He would walk to the public restroom in St. James's Park to wash his face and hands as best he could, then make his way to the same spot near the palace gates, where he would sit quietly and observe the changing of the guard ceremony. Thomas was 62 years old, with gray hair that he kept as neat as possible despite his circumstances, and weathered hands that showed the evidence of decades of hard work. His clothes were worn and patched, but he kept them as clean as he could manage. Most people walking by wouldn't give him a second glance, seeing only another homeless man among the many who populated London's streets. But Thomas wasn't just any homeless man. 25 years earlier, he had been Sergeant Thomas Hartwell of Her Majesty's Royal Marines, a decorated veteran who had served his country with pride and distinction. A series of personal tragedies and poor decisions had led him to his current situation, but he had never lost his respect for military discipline and honor. Every day, Thomas would position himself on a bench near the palace gates at the same time, 30 minutes before the changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled to begin. He would sit up straight, his hands folded in his lap, and watch the proceedings with the keen eye of someone who understood the precision and dedication required for such a performance. The tourists around him chattered and took photos, remained silent and respectful throughout the entire ceremony. He recognized the discipline in the guards' movements, the pride in their bearing, and the weight of tradition they carried on their shoulders. It reminded him of his own years of service, when he had stood at attention in far more dangerous places than the courtyard of Buckingham Palace. On this particular morning in early October, Thomas noticed something different about one of the guards. The young man, who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, seemed to be struggling with his composure. His shoulders were slightly tense, and there was something in his expression that suggested he was dealing with more than just the physical demands of standing perfectly still for hours. Thomas had seen that look before, in young soldiers under his command who were facing personal challenges that threatened to interfere with their duty. It was a look that said the person was fighting an internal battle while trying to maintain their external discipline. The guard's name tag read Mills, and Thomas found himself paying particular attention to the young man throughout the ceremony. He could see the slight tremor in Mills' hands, the way his breathing occasionally became more labored, and the occasional flicker of something that might have been distress in his eyes. When the ceremony concluded and the guards returned to their posts, Thomas remained on his bench, thinking about what he had observed. He had no way of knowing what was troubling Guard Mills, but his years of military experience had taught him to recognize when someone was struggling, even when they were trying their best to hide it. As the crowds of tourists dispersed, Thomas made his way to his usual spot for the afternoon, a small area near the palace where he would sit quietly and sometimes receive spare change from passers-by. He never asked for money directly, but he had learned that his military bearing and quiet dignity sometimes prompted people to offer help. That afternoon, Thomas noticed Guard Mills again during the guard rotation. The young man's distress seemed to have worsened rather than improved. His hands were shaking more noticeably, and Thomas could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool October weather. Thomas had been in the military long enough to recognize the signs of someone who was pushing themselves beyond their limits. Someone who was trying to maintain their duty despite personal crisis or physical illness. It was both admirable and concerning, the kind of dedication that could be both a strength and a dangerous weakness. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself thinking more and more about Guard Mills. In his days as a sergeant, Thomas had been responsible for the welfare of the young soldiers under his command. He had learned to spot trouble early and to intervene before small problems became major crises. Now, sitting on the street with nothing but the clothes on his back and a few coins in his pocket, Thomas felt helpless to offer the kind of assistance he would have provided during his military days. but he couldn't shake the feeling that Guard Mills needed help. His instincts told him that the situation was more serious than a simple case of nerves or fatigue. That evening, as Thomas prepared to settle into his doorway for another night on the streets, he made a decision that would change both his life and Guard Mills' life in ways neither of them could have imagined. He decided that tomorrow he would find a way to help the young guard. Even if he wasn't sure yet what form that help would take, Thomas had very little left in the world, but he still had his experience, his knowledge of military life, and his understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. If Guard Mills was struggling, Thomas was determined to find a way to offer whatever assistance he could provide. As he pulled his thin blanket around his shoulders and tried to find a comfortable position in the cold doorway, Thomas thought about the young guard's troubled expression and made a silent promise to himself. Tomorrow, he would do what he could to help a fellow service member, regardless of his own difficult circumstances. The night was cold and long, but Thomas slept better than he had in weeks, comforted by the knowledge that he had found a purpose beyond simple survival. The next morning, Thomas arrived at his usual bench 30 minutes earlier than normal, determined to get a better understanding of what was troubling Guard Mills. He positioned himself where he could observe the guard's approach to his post, hoping to gather more information about the young man's condition. When Guard Mills arrived for his shift, Thomas immediately noticed that the situation had worsened overnight. The young guard's uniform was impeccable as always, but his face was pale and drawn, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept well. More concerning to Thomas was the way Mills seemed to be favoring his left side, moving with a subtle stiffness that suggested he might be dealing with pain or injury. Thomas watched carefully as Mills took his position at the guard post. The young man's military training was evident in his perfect posture and disciplined bearing, but Thomas's experienced eye could see the signs of someone who was struggling to maintain their composure. Mills' breathing was shallow and occasionally irregular, and there was a slight tremor in his hands that he was clearly trying to suppress. As the morning progressed, Thomas observed Mills throughout his duty period, noting every sign of distress. The guard would occasionally close his eyes for slightly longer than a normal blink, as if fighting off dizziness or fatigue. His jaw was clenched in a way that suggested he was dealing with significant discomfort, and Thomas could see beads of perspiration forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Around mid-morning, something happened that confirmed Thomas's worst fears. Guard Mills swayed slightly on his feet, barely catching himself before anyone else noticed. The movement was so subtle that the tourists and other observers missed it entirely. But Thomas's trained eye caught the momentary loss of balance. Had seen similar symptoms before in young soldiers who had been pushing themselves too hard or dealing with medical issues they were afraid to report. In the military, there was often pressure to maintain duty readiness, even when facing personal or health challenges. And some soldiers would rather collapse than admit they needed help. During his lunch break, Thomas made his way to a small cafe near the palace where he had sometimes been given leftover food by sympathetic staff members. He struck up a conversation with Mary, one of the waitresses who had been kind to him in the past. "Mary," Thomas said carefully, "I've been watching the guards at the palace. I'm concerned about one of the young men. He seems to be struggling with something, but I don't know how to help." Mary looked at Thomas with interest. She had always been impressed by his respectful manner and obvious intelligence, and she knew from their previous conversations that he was a military veteran. "What kind of struggling?" she asked, refilling his cup of tea. Thomas described what he had observed, being careful to focus on the specific physical symptoms rather than making assumptions about their cause. "In my military days, I would have been able to intervene, but now... ... double quotes. He gestured to his worn clothes and homeless appearance. Mary nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Thomas, there might be a way you could help. My brother works security at one of the government buildings near the palace. You might know how to get a message to the right people if you're really concerned about this guard's welfare." Thomas felt a spark of hope. "I don't want to get the young man in trouble. I just want to make sure he gets help if he needs it. Let me talk to my brother tonight," Mary said. "Maybe he can give us some advice about the best way to handle this." Afternoon, Thomas returned to his observation post with renewed purpose. He continued to monitor Guard Mills, and his concerns only deepened. The young guard was clearly struggling more as the day progressed, and Thomas could see that his condition was deteriorating rather than improving. Around 3 o'clock, Thomas witnessed something that made his decision for him. Guard Mills stumbled slightly while changing position, quickly recovering, but not before Thomas saw the flash of pain that crossed his face. The guard's complexion had become even paler, and Thomas could see that he was fighting to maintain consciousness. Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. Despite his homeless appearance and the likelihood that he would be dismissed or ignored, he stood up from his bench and approached the area near the guard post. He didn't get close enough to interfere with Mills' duties, but he positioned himself where the guard could see him clearly. Then, Thomas did something he hadn't done in years. He stood at perfect military attention, his back straight and his chin up, and offered Guard Mills a crisp military salute. It was a gesture of respect from one service member to another, a recognition of shared duty and mutual understanding. Guard Mills' eyes widened slightly when he saw the salute, and for a moment his rigid composure softened. Thomas could see recognition in the young man's eyes, an understanding that the homeless man standing before him was not just another curious tourist, but someone who understood the weight of military service. Thomas held the salute for exactly the appropriate amount of time, then lowered his hand and nodded slightly to Mills before returning to his bench. The exchange had lasted only a few seconds, but Thomas hoped it had communicated what he intended, that someone was watching. Someone cared, and someone understood what the guard was going through. For the rest of the afternoon, Thomas noticed a subtle change in Guard Mills' demeanor. The young man still appeared to be struggling physically, but there seemed to be a slight improvement in his emotional bearing, as if the recognition from a fellow veteran had provided some measure of comfort or strength. As the day shift ended and Guard Mills was relieved by another guard, Thomas saw the young man glance in his direction. Their eyes met briefly, and Thomas saw something that might have been gratitude in Mills' expression before the guard turned and walked away. That evening, Thomas returned to the cafe to meet with Mary and hopefully speak with her brother about the best way to help Guard Mills. He felt more hopeful than he had in months, not just because he might be able to help someone in need, but because he had been reminded that his military experience and instincts still had value, even in his current circumstances. As he walked through the London streets toward the cafe, Thomas reflected on how strange it was that his life had brought him to this moment. A year and a half ago, he never could have imagined that he would be living on the streets, let alone trying to help a royal guard from his position as a homeless veteran. But perhaps, Thomas thought, this was exactly why he had ended up where he was. Perhaps his own struggles and losses had prepared him to recognize and respond to someone else's moment of crisis. Mary's brother, Detective Inspector Robert Chen, arrived at the cafe that evening with a skeptical expression that quickly changed to one of genuine interest as Thomas described his observations of Guard Mills. Robert had 20 years of experience in law enforcement and had learned to recognize when someone was providing reliable information versus when they were simply seeking attention. "Mr. Hartwell," Robert said after listening carefully to Thomas's account, "your observations are very detailed and specific. You clearly have military experience. What was your background?" Thomas straightened slightly in his chair, some of his old military bearing returning. "Royal Marines, 22 years of service, sergeant rank when I retired. I served in Northern Ireland, the Falklands, and 2 tours in Afghanistan." Robert's demeanor shifted to one of respect. "That's impressive service, Sergeant." Mary tells me you've been having some difficult times. Thomas nodded, not elaborating on the personal tragedies and poor decisions that had led to his current situation. "That's not important right now. What matters is that young guard. In my experience, when a soldier starts showing those symptoms but continues to report for duty, it usually means they're either dealing with a serious medical issue they're afraid to report, or they're facing personal problems that are affecting their health." Robert pulled out a small notebook. "The protocol for reporting concerns about Royal Guard welfare is actually quite straightforward. There's a chain of command that handles these situations, and they take them seriously. The challenge is that reports usually come through official Channels, not from, ... double quotes, he paused diplomatically. Not from homeless veterans, Thomas finished with a slight smile. I understand. But surely the information itself is more important than the source. Absolutely, Robert agreed. Let me make some calls tonight. I have contacts in the palace security office who can handle this appropriately. The next morning, Thomas was surprised to see a different guard at Mill's usual post. His heart sank, worried that perhaps his intervention had somehow caused problems. For the young man spent the day anxiously wondering what had happened and whether he had made the right decision in speaking up. That evening, as Thomas was settling into his doorway for the night, he was approached by a man in civilian clothes who looked official despite his casual appearance. Mr. Hartwell? I'm Captain James Morrison, personnel officer for the Queen's Guard. I understand. You've been concerned about one of our guards. Thomas stood up, automatically coming to attention despite his circumstances. Yes, sir, Guard Mills. I was worried about his condition. Captain Morrison studied Thomas carefully. Detective Inspector Chen vouched for your military background and the reliability of your observations. I want you to know that we take the welfare of our guards very seriously, and we're grateful for your concern. Is Mills all right, sir? Thomas asked. He's receiving the medical attention he needs, Captain Morrison replied. It turns out you were right to be concerned. Guard Mills had been dealing with a serious medical condition that he was afraid to report because he didn't want to be removed from duty. Your observations helped us identify the situation before it became a genuine emergency. Thomas felt a wave of relief wash over him. I'm glad he's getting help. In my experience, the young ones sometimes try to push through problems they should be addressing. Captain Morrison nodded. Guard Mills asked me to find you. He wanted to thank you personally for your concern, and he has something he'd like to give you. Thomas was confused. He wants to meet with me. If you're willing, Captain Morrison said. He's currently on medical leave. But he specifically requested the opportunity to speak with the veteran who showed such concern for his welfare. 2 days later, Thomas found himself in an unprecedented situation. He was sitting in a small office within the palace complex, having been escorted there by Captain Morrison after being provided with an opportunity to clean up and given a temporary visitor's pass. Guard Mills, dressed in civilian clothes and looking much healthier than when Thomas had last seen him, entered the office with a warm smile. Mr. Hartwell, I'm Jonathan Mills. I can't thank you enough for what you did. Thomas shook the young man's hand, still somewhat overwhelmed by the turn of events. I'm just glad you're all right, son. What was the problem, if you don't mind me asking? Jonathan's expression grew more serious. Diabetes. I was diagnosed just before I started this position, and I was so afraid of being disqualified that I tried to manage it on my own. I wasn't doing a very good job of it. Thomas nodded understandingly. That's a dangerous game to play. I've seen soldiers try to hide medical conditions before. It usually doesn't end well. It almost didn't, Jonathan admitted. The day you saluted me, I was on the verge of a diabetic emergency. Seeing that recognition from you, knowing that someone understood what I was going through, it helped me realize that I needed to ask for help rather than trying to handle everything alone. Jonathan reached into a bag beside his chair and pulled out a carefully wrapped package. I wanted to give you something. It's not much, but it's important to me, and I hope it will be meaningful to you as well. Thomas unwrapped the package too. Find a beautiful wooden frame containing a photograph of the Queen's Guard in formation, along with a small medallion bearing the royal insignia. Below the photo was an engraved plaque that read, "To Sergeant Thomas Hartwell, Royal Marines, with gratitude for your service to country and to fellow servicemen. Your vigilance and care exemplify the finest traditions of military brotherhood." Thomas stared at the gift, his eyes filling with tears. It had been so long since anyone had acknowledged his military service or treated him with the respect he had once known. Jonathan, I don't know what to say. This is beautiful. There's more, Jonathan said quietly. Captain Morrison and I have been talking with some of the other officers about your situation. We know you're a decorated veteran who's fallen on hard times, and we believe you deserve better. Captain Morrison stepped forward. Mr. Hartwell, we'd like to offer you a position. It's not military service, but it's connected to it. We need someone with your experience and observational skills to help with veteran outreach and welfare monitoring. The pay isn't enormous, but it comes with housing assistance and full benefits." Thomas looked back and forth between the two men, hardly able to believe what he was hearing. "You're offering me a job? We're offering you an opportunity to use your skills and experience to help other veterans," Captain Morrison clarified. "Your background, combined with your obvious dedication to the welfare of service members, makes you exactly the kind of person we need for this program." Thomas felt as though the world had shifted around him. In the space of a few days, his simple gesture of concern for a struggling young guard had transformed his entire life prospects. "I accept," he said quietly. "I would be honored to serve in whatever capacity you need." Jonathan smiled broadly. "There's one more thing, Mr. Hartwell. I want you to know that your salute that day. The recognition you showed me when I was at my lowest point, it reminded me that I wasn't alone. That moment of connection from one service member to another gave me the strength to ask for help." As Thomas left the palace that day, carrying his framed photograph and walking toward his new beginning, he reflected on the unexpected ways that life could change. His own dark period had prepared him to recognize another person's struggle, and his decision to reach out despite his own difficult circumstances had created a connection that benefited them both. 3 weeks later, Thomas stood in front of a mirror in his new studio apartment. Adjusting the collar of his first new shirt in over 2 years, the Veterans Outreach Coordinator position that Captain Morrison had offered him came with a modest salary, but more importantly, it provided him with housing assistance that had allowed him to secure this small but clean place to live. The apartment was sparse, furnished with only the basics, but to Thomas, it felt like a palace after 18 months on the streets. He had a bed, a small kitchenette, and most importantly, a sense of dignity and purpose that he had thought was lost forever. On his small table sat the framed photograph and medallion that Jonathan had given him, serving as a daily reminder of how dramatically his life had changed. Thomas's new role involved visiting veterans who were struggling with various challenges. From homelessness to medical issues to mental health problems, his own recent experience living on the streets gave him unique insights and credibility. When working with veterans who had fallen through the cracks of the system, his first major assignment came from Captain Morrison personally. Thomas Weave identified a veteran living rough near Westminster Bridge. Former Army, served in Iraq. He's been resistant to previous outreach efforts, but we think your approach might be more effective. Thomas nodded, understanding the assignment. What's his background? Staff Sergeant Michael Davies, 15 years of service. Lost his leg in an IED explosion, struggled with PTSD and addiction after his medical discharge. He's been on the streets for about 8 months now. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Michael's story was similar to his own in many ways, though Thomas's downfall had been caused by different circumstances. I'll find him, Thomas said simply. That afternoon, Thomas walked to Westminster Bridge, his trained eye scanning the area for someone who might be a military veteran. He found Michael sitting in a sheltered spot under the bridge, his missing leg immediately visible despite his attempts to conceal it with a blanket. Staff Sergeant Davies, Thomas said quietly, approaching slowly and respectfully. Michael looked up with suspicious eyes. Who's asking? Sergeant Thomas Hartwell, Royal Marines. I'd like to talk with you, if you're willing. Michael's expression softened slightly at the military identification. What about? Thomas sat down nearby, not too close, but within comfortable conversation distance, about how a homeless veteran can end up with a job and an apartment in the space of 3 weeks. The next hour, Thomas shared his story with Michael, explaining how his observation of guard mills had led to an unexpected chain of events that had completely transformed his circumstances. He was careful not to make it sound easy or guaranteed, but he wanted Michael to understand that change was possible even from the most difficult situations. You're telling me that some young guard got you a job just because you were worried? About him? Michael asked skeptically. Not exactly, Thomas replied. The guard's gratitude opened a door, but what really mattered was that I had something to offer. My experience, my knowledge of military life, My understanding of what veterans go through when they struggle? Michael was quiet for a long moment. I've had people try to help me before. Social workers, counselors, other veterans. Nothing ever stuck. Thomas nodded. I understand. I turned down help plenty of times myself. But this is different because it's not about someone helping you out of pity or obligation. It's about recognizing that your experience and skills have value even when you can't see it yourself. Over the following weeks, Thomas continued to visit Michael, slowly building trust and rapport. He didn't push or pressure, but simply made himself available and continued to share his own journey from homelessness to stability. Meanwhile, Thomas was discovering that his new role was more fulfilling than any job he had ever held. His work involved not just finding struggling veterans, but also helping to develop programs and policies that addressed the systemic issues that led to veteran homelessness and neglect. Jonathan Mills, who had recovered fully from his diabetic crises and returned to his duties with the Queen's Guard, became a regular visitor to Thomas's apartment. The two men had developed a friendship that transcended their different backgrounds and ages. Bonded by their shared military experience and the dramatic way their lives had intersected. Thomas, Jonathan said during one of his visits, I've been thinking about what happened between us, and I realized that it was about more than just you helping me with a medical crisis. Thomas looked up from the report he was writing about veteran housing needs. What do you mean? You showed me that military brotherhood doesn't end when you leave active service, Jonathan explained. Even when you were at your lowest point, living on the streets with nothing, you still felt responsible for the welfare of a fellow service member. That's the kind of character that doesn't disappear just because circumstances change. Thomas was moved by Jonathan's words, but he also felt compelled to share something he had been thinking about. Jonathan, I need you to know that helping you helped me just as much as it helped you. Maybe more. How so? Thomas set down his pen and looked at his young friend. When I was on the streets, I felt like I had lost everything that made me who my military service felt like it belonged to someone else, like it was part of a life I could never get back. But when I saw you struggling and recognized what was happening, it reminded me that my experience and training still had value. Jonathan nodded thoughtfully. So by helping me, you were also reclaiming your own sense of purpose. Exactly. That's what I try to explain to the veterans I work with now. Your lowest point doesn't erase who you are or what you've accomplished. Sometimes it just takes the right moment or the right connection to remember your own worth. That evening, Thomas received a phone call that brought unexpected news. It was Michael Davies, calling from a treatment facility where he had finally agreed to seek help for his addiction and PTSD. Thomas, Michael said, his voice stronger than Thomas had ever heard it. I wanted to let you know that I'm ready to start over. And I wanted to ask if there might be room in your outreach program for another veteran who understands what it's like to hit bottom. Thomas smiled, looking at the framed photograph on his table and thinking about the chain of events. That had started with a simple salute to a struggling young guard. Michael, I think there's definitely room for you. Welcome back to the fight. As Thomas hung up the phone, he realized that the story that had begun with his concern for Jonathan Mills was continuing to expand and touch more lives. Each veteran who found their way back from the darkness was creating the possibility for helping others, building a network of support and understanding that grew stronger with each connection. 6 months after Michael Davies joined the Veteran Outreach Program, Thomas found himself standing in front of a room filled with government officials, military officers, and social workers, presenting the results of their expanded veteran support initiative. What had started as a simple gesture of concern between two service members had grown into a comprehensive program that was being considered as a model for veteran outreach across the United Kingdom. The key to our success, Thomas explained, to the assembled group has been recognizing that veterans who have experienced homelessness and recovery are uniquely qualified to help other veterans facing similar challenges. They bring credibility, understanding, and hope that traditional social services often cannot provide. Captain Morrison, who had been promoted to major and was now overseeing veteran affairs for the military, nodded approvingly as Thomas presented the statistics. In 6 months, Their program had successfully connected with over 60 homeless veterans, with a 75% success rate in getting them into stable housing and treatment programs. Mr. Hartwell asked a representative from the Department of Health and Social Care, "What do you attribute to this unusually high success rate?" Thomas thought carefully about his answer. "I think it's because we approach each veteran not as a problem to be solved, but as a person with valuable experience who has temporarily lost their way." When Michael Davies talks to a homeless veteran about recovery, he's not speaking from theory or training. He's speaking from lived experience. Michael, who is now Thomas's assistant coordinator and had been clean and sober for 4 months, stepped forward to address the group. "When I was living under that bridge, I had social workers and counselors tell me that recovery was possible. But when Thomas sat down next to me and told me how he had gone from sleeping in doorways to having a job in an apartment, I could see the proof right in front of me." After the presentation, Thomas and Michael were approached by Colonel Sarah Henderson, a senior officer who oversaw veteran affairs at the Ministry of Defense. "Gentlemen," she said, "I'm impressed by what you've accomplished. We're considering expanding this program nationally, and we'd like your input on how to scale it effectively." Thomas felt a surge of pride mixed with responsibility. "Colonel, we'd be honored to help develop a national program. I think it's important that we maintain the personal connection aspect that makes this approach effective." "What do you mean?" she asked. Michael answered, "The program works because veterans trust other veterans who have been through similar struggles. If we scale it too quickly or make it too bureaucratic, we might lose that essential element of peer support and understanding." Colonel Henderson nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly the kind of insight we need. Would you be willing to work with our planning committee to develop implementation guidelines?" That evening, Thomas and Michael celebrated their success at a small pub near Thomas's apartment. Jonathan Mills joined them, having become a regular, part of their informal support network despite his continued duties with the Queen's Guard. "I still can't believe how much has changed," Jonathan said, raising his pint. 6 months ago, Thomas was living on the streets. Michael was struggling with addiction, and I was hiding a medical condition that could have killed me. Thomas smiled. "And now we're all doing work that actually matters, helping people who need. At most, there's something else," Michael added. "I got a call today from my daughter. We haven't spoken in 3 years, not since my addiction got really bad. She saw an article about our program in the newspaper and recognized my name." Thomas and Jonathan both looked at Michael with interest and concern. "She wants to meet Michael," continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "She said she's proud of what I'm doing now, and she wants to try to rebuild our relationship." The 3 men sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each thinking about the unexpected ways their lives had intersected and improved. "You know," Thomas said finally, "when I first approached you under that bridge, Michael, I thought I was just doing my job, but working with you has taught me as much as it's taught you." "How so?" Michael asked. "You've shown me that recovery isn't just about getting back to where you were before. It's about becoming someone better than you were before, someone who can use their struggles to help others." Jonathan nodded. "That's what happened to me too. My diabetic crisis could have ended my military career, but instead, it led me to understand the importance of asking for help and being honest about your struggles." The conversation was interrupted by Thomas's phone ringing. He answered to find Captain Morrison on the other end, calling with unexpected news. "Thomas, I hope you're sitting down. The Queen's office has been following the progress of your veteran outreach program. I'd like to invite you, Michael and Jonathan, to receive recognition for your service to veterans at a special ceremony next month."
Yes.
Thomas nearly dropped his phone. "Captain, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying that your work has been noticed at the highest levels. The ceremony will include media coverage, which means your program will get national attention. Are you prepared for that kind of visibility?" Thomas looked at Michael and Jonathan, both of whom were watching his face with curiosity. "Captain, if it helps more veterans get the support they need, we're ready for whatever comes next." After Thomas hung up and explained the call to his friends, Michael shook his head in amazement. From homeless addict to meeting the Queen, if someone had told me that story a year ago, I would have thought they were crazy. "It's not about meeting the Queen," Thomas said. It's about the platform it gives us to reach veterans who are still struggling, still think there's no way back from rock bottom. Jonathan raised his pint again. 2-second chances and the power of one person caring enough to reach out to another. As they toasted their friendship and their shared mission, Thomas thought about the salute he had given to a struggling young guard 6 months earlier. That simple gesture of recognition and respect had set in motion a chain of events that had transformed not just their 3 lives, the lives of dozens of other veterans who had found hope and support through their program. The homeless man, who had once sat on a bench outside Buckingham Palace, watching the guards with respectful attention, was now preparing to meet the Queen herself.
Oh.
But more importantly, he was part of a growing movement that was proving every day that no veteran should be left behind, no matter how far they had fallen or how impossible their recovery might seem. The morning of the royal ceremony dawned crisp and clear, and Thomas stood in his apartment looking at himself in the mirror with a sense of wonder that still felt surreal. The man staring back at him bore little resemblance to the homeless veteran who had sat on a bench outside Buckingham Palace 8 months earlier. His hair was neatly trimmed, his face clean-shaven, and he wore a new suit that Michael had helped him select for the occasion. On his dresser sat the framed photograph that Jonathan had given him, alongside a small collection of letters from veterans who had been helped by their outreach program. Each letter represented a life that had been touched by the chain of connection that started with his simple salute to a struggling young guard. Michael arrived at Thomas's apartment an hour before they were scheduled to leave for the palace. His transformation was equally remarkable, clean, sober, and radiating the confidence that came from having found purpose in helping others. He carried a small briefcase containing documentation of their program's success stories, including his own daughter's letter expressing pride in his recovery and their renewed relationship. "Ready for this, Thomas?" Michael asked, adjusting his own new tie. Thomas picked up the framed photograph and looked at it one more time. "You know, Michael, I keep thinking about how this all started. I was just a homeless man trying to help. Someone I thought was in trouble. I never imagined it would lead to this." "That's the point, though, isn't it?" Michael replied. "You didn't help Jonathan because you expected something in return. You helped him because it was the right thing to do. Everything that followed grew out of that genuine caring." Jonathan arrived a few minutes later, resplendent in his dress uniform. The young guard who had once struggled alone with his medical condition now carried himself with renewed confidence and purpose. He had become an advocate within the military for better support systems for service members facing health challenges. "Gentlemen," Jonathan said with a grin, "are you ready to meet Her Majesty?" The ceremony took place in one of the smaller reception rooms at Buckingham Palace, intimate enough to feel personal but formal enough to honor the significance of the occasion. About 50 people were present, including military officers, government officials, representatives from veteran organizations, several veterans who had been helped by Thomas and Michael's program. When the Queen entered the room, Thomas felt his military training take over. He stood at perfect attention. The same posture he had maintained during his 22 years of service in the Royal Marines. But this time he was standing not as a young soldier eager to prove himself, but as a veteran who had found his way back from the darkness and was now helping others do the same. "Mr. Hartwell," the Queen said as she approached him, "I understand that your work with homeless veterans has achieved remarkable results." "Your Majesty," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite his emotions, "the real achievement belongs to the veterans who found the courage to accept help and rebuild their lives. I've simply been privileged to be part of their journey." The Queen smiled slightly. "I'm told that your program began with an act of kindness toward one of my guards." Thomas glanced at Jonathan, who was standing nearby in formation with other palace personnel. "Yes, Your Majesty. Guard Mills was struggling, and my military experience helped me recognize that he needed assistance. But what I learned from that experience was that helping others often helps us heal ourselves. And Mr. Davies," the Queen continued, turning to Michael, "you've overcome significant personal challenges to become part of this program." Michael straightened slightly, still somewhat awed by the situation. "Your Majesty, when I was living on the streets, I thought my life was over. Thomas showed me that our lowest moments don't define us. How we respond to them, and how we use them to help others, that's what defines us." The Queen nodded approvingly. "The work you're doing represents the finest traditions of military service, looking after one's comrades and ensuring that no one is left behind." During the formal part of the ceremony, Thomas, Michael, and Jonathan each received commendations for their service to veterans and their innovative approach to outreach and support. But for Thomas, the most meaningful moment came when the Queen asked to hear more about their specific methods and future plans. "Your Majesty," Thomas explained, "we've learned that the most effective way to reach struggling veterans is through other veterans who have faced similar challenges. When Michael talks to someone living on the streets about recovery, or when I share my story of going from homelessness to stable housing, it carries a weight that traditional social services often cannot provide. You're expanding this approach nationally?" the Queen asked. Michael stepped forward. "Yes, Your Majesty. We're working with the Ministry of Defense to train veteran peer counselors in cities across the UK. The goal is to create a network where no veteran has to face their struggles alone." After the formal ceremony was a reception where Thomas had the opportunity to meet with other veterans, military officials, and social workers who were interested in implementing similar programs in their regions. The conversations were energizing and hopeful, filled with stories of success and plans for expansion. Colonel Henderson approached Thomas during the reception with exciting news. "Thomas, I wanted to let you know that your program has attracted international attention. The Department of Veterans Affairs in the United States has asked for detailed information about your methods, and similar inquiries have come from Canada and Australia." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they had apparently set in motion. "Colonel, when I saluted that young guard 8 months ago, I was just trying to let him know that someone cared. I never imagined it would lead to anything like this. That's exactly why it's been so successful," she replied. "It came from genuine concern rather than policy or bureaucracy. That authenticity is what makes veterans trust the program." As the day wound down, Thomas, Michael, Jonathan found themselves back in the same pub where they had celebrated their early successes months earlier. This time they were joined by several other veterans who had been helped by their program, creating a small community of people whose lives had been interconnected through shared struggle and mutual support. "I keep thinking about something the Queen said," Michael reflected, "about how our work represents military traditions of not leaving anyone behind. When I was at my lowest point, I felt like I had been left behind by everyone. But Thomas proved that wasn't true." Jonathan raised his glass. "To Thomas, who showed all of us that a single act of caring can change everything." Thomas shook his head. "No, to all of us. What we've learned is that recovery and redemption aren't individual achievements. They happen through connection, through community, through people caring enough to reach out even when they're struggling themselves." As they talked late into the evening, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A homeless veteran's concern for a struggling guard had grown into a national program that was helping hundreds of veterans reclaim their lives and dignity. But beyond the recognition and expansion, what meant the most to Thomas was the knowledge that somewhere in London that night, there were veterans who were no longer sleeping rough, who had reconnected with their families, who had found purpose and hope again. Each of those individual stories was a testament to the power of one person caring enough to reach out to another. The next morning, Thomas woke up in his apartment and looked at the new commendation from the Queen. Sitting beside Jonathan's original framed photograph, both represented the same truth: that service doesn't end when you leave the military, that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but on the streets of your own country, one struggling veteran at a time. Thomas dressed for another day of outreach work, knowing that somewhere in London there were veterans who needed someone to notice their struggle and care enough to help. The homeless man who had once honored a royal guard with a simple salute was now ready to continue that tradition of service, one connection at a time.